Hey guys, welcome to SJ Weekly for July 1st, 2018. And you know what that means, right? It's Canada Day! Let's spend today going over some of the most ridiculous Canadian SJW bullshit I can find. And why don't we start at the top with Justin Trudeau. To those who marched here in Canada for an end to gun violence, we hear you. And this week we introduced a plan for common sense gun control that will keep our communities safer. This was in March 24th, 2018. Meaning that it was happening around the whole Emma Gonzalez, David Hogg school shooting bullshit in the States. Well, even though Canada already has stricter gun laws than the States, a bunch of Canadians still marched in support. And Trudeau took this opportunity to do some virtue signaling. Let's actually read that legislation, though. Firearms legislation to make communities safer. Crime rates generally in Canada have been on the decline for more than 2 decades, but offenses involving firearms have become more prevalent, especially since 2013. Many communities across the country have been facing a steady increase in gun violence over the past 5 years. Gun-related homicides, domestic and gender-based violence involving guns, criminal gang activity, and gun thefts are all up significantly. To keep communities safe, the Government of Canada is strengthening Canada's gun laws in a common-sense, focused, and effective way. Legislation introduced today prioritizes public safety and effective police work, while respecting law-abiding firearms owners. This government will not bring back the federal long gun registry. Now, all of those problems there, the gun-related homicides, domestic and gender-based violence involving guns, criminal gang activity, and gun thefts, those are all already illegal, and a lot of those, especially the gang violence, are committed with illegally owned guns anyway. So I'm not exactly sure what stricter regulations on guns is going to do to help with something like criminal gang activity. The first 4 points on this list are at least somewhat reasonable, so I'm not going to go over them, but let's talk about point 5 here. The new legislation proposes to bolster community safety in relation to restricted and prohibited firearms, mostly handguns and assault weapons. The term assault weapon is one of those weasel words that doesn't really mean anything in terms of any kind of real-world gun classification. It's a very vague, very general idea that doesn't actually correspond to any class of gun in reality. So whenever I see some kind of gun legislation bring up assault weapons, to me, that basically means that they're looking to heavily restrict things based on vague criteria. And considering that the Democrats in the United States have been using this term to try and do the same thing for the past 20 years or so, I'm not surprised to see it here. But while we're on the topic of government legislative ineffectualness, decriminalizing prostitution would negatively impact Indigenous women. A London, Ontario court is hearing arguments about the constitutionality of Canada's prostitution laws. An academic testifying about Canada's prostitution laws says decriminalization would disproportionately affect Indigenous women and girls. Even in a system where prostitution is legal, if you have girls working as prostitutes and not just women, you have a whole other problem. Indigenous women are now overrepresented in the sex industry, but there's no evidence that prostitution existed prior to colonization, said Cherry Smiley, an academic who studies the impact of prostitution on the lives of Indigenous women and girls. Well, first of all, Cherry Smiley, are you sure that that's not your own prostitute name? Because it kind of sounds like it might be. But this idea that prostitution didn't exist prior to colonization, it's called the oldest profession in the world for a reason. Even if Canada's native population hadn't invented money yet on the time of European contact, I'm sure there were still women out there who traded sex for other things, for goods, or for protection, or for access to certain lands, or whatever. Because the truth is, Indigenous women are human too, and there is always some kind of sex trade wherever humans go. I honestly thought it was racist nowadays to believe in the idea of the noble savage. The underlying ideology of sex buyers is that they can buy a woman and engage in sex on his terms, Smiley said. Well, no, you've got that completely wrong. You call them sex buyers because they're not buying a woman, they're buying sex. They're not purchasing a good, they're obtaining a service. For example, if you were to call me, say, a meal buyer. And then using this sentence structure, you could say that I go to a restaurant, I buy a waitress, and I engage in her serving me food on my terms. and then that arrangement ends when I've finished the meal, I've paid, and I've left the restaurant. It's the same thing with prostitutes. You don't actually buy the woman. You don't actually buy the waitress. You buy the food and you eat it. Or you buy the sex, but you don't buy the person. In essence, the sex buyer is paying for a service, and there is a reasonable expectation that that service is provided. You can say that, oh, these women don't want to do it, they're just doing it for the money. Well, that's most jobs. Most people don't want to be waitresses or waiters. They do it for the money. Most people don't want to go work in a factory. They do it for the money. Most people don't want to collect garbage or plow roads, but they do it for the money. This is no different. Smiley was the Crown's first witness. She's an Indigenous woman who has done an art exhibit with women who work in prostitution, and she has worked with women who have suffered abuse and sexual violence. Those two things are very different, and I don't know why this article conflates them in this way. The court case centers around a London couple who was charged after the escort agency they were running, Fantasy World Escorts, was shut down by London police in November 2015. Their lawyers are arguing that 3 of the charges, procuring, advertising, and materially benefiting from the sexual services of someone else, violate sex workers' constitutional right to the security of the person. And that's actually true. I think it was back in 2012, prostitution was just straight up illegal in Canada. And another court case heard making it illegal for prostitutes to engage in sex work made it disproportionately unsafe. And that level of unsafety was driven only by government intervention. And back then, Canada ended up striking those laws down and made it legal to be a prostitute, but made it illegal to be a John or to live off the gains of somebody else's prostitution like a pimp. However, anybody who knows even a little bit about this topic will tell you that prostitution in a brothel is generally a lot safer than walking the street. She said there are stereotypes about Indigenous women as hypersexed, and decriminalizing prostitution and seeing it as work would entrench those stereotypes because women would be choosing to work in the sex industry. So the possibility that women would choose to do this, because that apparently reinforces these negative stereotypes, therefore you want to see it kept illegal. There's an ongoing debate between institutionalized feminism and choice feminism, which is basically just this sentence in a nutshell. Prostitution is built on a foundation of inequality, so decriminalization would justify that inequality. If it's a fair exchange, where is the inequality? Is there inequality because the woman needs money and the man has it and they're willing to exchange sex for money? Should she just get the money without having sex with him? Is that where you're going to go with this? Under cross-examination, Smiley was asked several times about a line in her art piece in which she characterizes those who see prostitution as sex work as racist white men who don't care if Indigenous women die. Now, I see prostitution as sex work. I want to see it legalized, and I do care if Indigenous women die. In fact, if there are a lot of Indigenous prostitutes, I think probably the best thing to do for them is to get them into some kind of government-regulated brothel instead of actually walking the streets where they can be picked up by anybody and then dumped off in a ditch when the guy's done with them. It's true that there are women who advocate for prostitution as sex work who are women, but that there are also men, and most of the buyers are men, and they have a vested interest to see it as work, Smiley said. My vested interest to see it as work is not based on me fucking them, because I have never once actually been with a prostitute, but it's because I don't want to see Indigenous women murdered and dumped off in the forest somewhere. And ultimately, that is what you are advocating for here. Smiley said she rejects the idea that decriminalization of prostitution or allowing women to work in escort agencies, for example, is a form of harm reduction, because in her view, the very act of prostitution is so harmful that the harm cannot be reduced. And this is where the ideology is. Alright? This is where the radical feminist ideology comes into this. Because it's not about individual women choosing to be prostitutes in a safe environment. It's about the fabric of femininity or some other bullshit that she's going to pull out. It's not about women's own choices. It's about her power structure. 2 defense witnesses testified earlier that the laws push the sex trade further underground and put sex workers at a greater risk of harm. Exactly. But let's get away from violence committed against women and talk about violence committed by women. Women who killed husbands rarely gave a warning and most weren't abused, study finds. The majority of the slayings, perpetuated by knife, gun, and strangulation, appear generally unheralded, suggests the analysis of 20 years of Quebec homicide files. Jesus, this is a terribly put together article. Conventional wisdom suggests that women usually kill their spouses in self-defense or as a final desperate reaction to chronic battery, the burning bed syndrome that is sometimes cited as a defense in murder trials. A new Canadian study, however, suggests that barely a quarter of husband killers are victims of domestic abuse. Less than half suffer from any identified psychological problem, and fewer still have had trouble with the police. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? It's almost like the reasons that women kill people are just as wide and varied as men. Women rarely give a warning before killing their mates, concluded the study, co-authored by Dr. Dominique Bourget, a forensic psychiatrist at the Royal Ottawa Medical Health Centre. In the vast majority of cases of women who killed their mates, there were very few indicators that might have signaled the risk and helped predict the violent, lethal behavior. Although 35% of the male victims had a history of at least one act of past violence, the researchers say they found evidence that just 26% of the women had been physically abused by their partners. That differs markedly from the findings of a 1989 American study that indicated almost all women who committed spousal homicides did so in an environment of domestic abuse, and a Canadian paper from the same period that attributed the motives for most such killings to self-defense, notes the study. To Don Dutton, a UBC psychology professor who has examined domestic violence for decades, the results of the new study are no surprise, despite what he called an erroneous understanding of intimate partner assault that continues to prevail in society. We've got a stereotype about domestic violence, that the oppressor or perpetrator is the male, and when female violence happens, it's a reaction against male violence. The stereotype is so strong that when you look at the actual data, you're shocked. Professor Dutton, author of the book Rethinking Domestic Violence, suggested that such assumptions evolved from the feminist view that family violence was a socio-political act of patriarchal men suppressing women. He argues instead that personality disorders in both male and female offenders better explain family violence than do social norms. Maybe in reality, not everything is about the patriarchy. Maybe mental health issues are cross-gender and are far more important than bullshit ideologies. Maybe it just turns out that women aren't these eternally pure beings always destined to be the victim, but are human just like men, and have all the same human downfalls that men do. Of course, saying that would be sexist. And speaking of sexism, Trudeau government tells public service to end use of words like mother, father, Mr., Mrs., and forcing a switch to gender-neutral language. I mean, at least they're not making up pronouns, right? In a change nobody asked for, the Trudeau government plans to ban frontline public service workers from saying Mr., Mrs., mother, and father. That's according to a report by Radio Canada, who gained access to government documents stipulating the change. Here are the key parts of that report. According to documents obtained by Radio Canada, the French language arm of CBC, frontline staff must now use gender-neutral language or gender-inclusive language. This avoids portraying a perceived bias towards a particular sex or gender, says a copy of speaking notes prepared for managers and team leaders. It is important that Service Canada, as an organization, reflects Canada's diverse population. It ensures that the views and interests of Canadians are taken into account when we develop policies, programs, services, and initiatives. The new guidelines also rule out using terms such as mother and father because they are gender-specific, and instead says the neutral term of parent should be used instead. The same goes for honorifics, such as Mr., Mrs., and Ms., and in both languages. Instead, employees are being directed to address customers by their full names or ask them what they want to be called. After the official opposition raised serious questions about the proposal, Social Development Minister, I can't fucking pronounce French names, guys, clarified the measures in what amounted to a desperate attempt to backtrack. And here's some tweets here. Let's be clear, Service Canada will continue to use Mr. and Miss when interacting with Canadians. We are only confirming how people want to be addressed as a matter of respect. We are proud that Service Canada reflects the diversity of Canada's population and is working to adapt to the reality of 21st century families. The way he presents it here is not really that big of a deal, right? Like, if you walk into Service Canada and you need something done and the person behind the desk says, should I call you Mr. or Mrs., or are you a mother or a father? It's not really that big of a deal, is it? That just seems a bit more like that overarching Canadian politeness that we've all come to know and love. But that's not quite what it is it? That's not what the government document says according to the report. Workers are being told that they must use gender-neutral language, not that they have the choice of whether to use it. The report notes that the document specifically rules out the use of terms like mother and father. This has been a usual tactic of the Trudeau government, who introduce some unpopular change and then try to distract from what the change really is with some spin, while not actually altering what they're doing behind the scenes. In fact, reports already contradict this. According to an official who asked to remain anonymous because they are not authorized to speak on the issue, the new directive is already in place and has led to some difficult situations for civil servants. It happens that when we talk to people and we ask, what is the name of parent number 1? People do not understand, said the official. Now that's the real problem, isn't it? Because if you have two parents and you can't differentiate them by something like gender, you have to place them in a numbered order. You have to go parent 1 and parent 2, or parent 3 or 4 if there are some real fucking degenerates out there. But the point is, in trying to avoid a gendered hierarchy of male and female, they are specifically making a new hierarchy that is simply numbered. So if the father is parent number 1 and the mother is parent number 2, in my opinion, that's a far stricter hierarchy than man-woman. And really, this is part of the larger problem of changing language to try and deny reality. Like, there are news stories coming out of schools banning the concept of best friends. So if you have one friend that you're really close to, like Dave and I, if Dave and I were best friends, we've been best friends since we were 5 years old, but that would be banned now. It's like, no, you can't be best friends with them. You have to equally play with everybody else in the playground now while you're at school. I mean, are they gonna project that into the private life too? Say that, kids can't hang out with each other disproportionately more than other kids when school's out? Let's end on Lindsay Shepherd and the Faith Goldy talk at Laurier University. Here's a tweet by Adida Chowdhury, I guess. I'm really proud and relieved that not only did you show Faith Goldy that her presence is unwelcome at Laurier, you did so with grace and peacefully, and nobody was hurt. I want to hear more about all of you who made no Nazis at Laurier possible. What happened here was that Faith Goldy, who is a right-wing white identitarian, was set up by Lindsay Shepherd to give a talk at Wilfrid Laurier University. I said this in How Cooked Is Canada Part 3. I don't agree with anything that Faith Goldy says, but I wouldn't kick her off a campus. It's more important to hear her ideas and debate them, even if just in your own head, than it is to censor her. But this person here is proud that somebody pulled the fire alarm and had the talk cancelled, and Lindsay Shepherd had this to say about it. It is not peaceful or graceful to pull a fire alarm to shut down a speaker's talk. This kind of mindset is absolutely deranged and pathological. People who derive pleasure from censoring others are sick and sad individuals. And really, I have to agree. The people who pulled the fire alarm and the people who support the fire alarm being pulled on Faith Goldy, what did they actually accomplish? Did they refute any of her ideas? Well, no, they didn't. Did they directly confront her? No. Did they present their own arguments? Absolutely not. This turns Faith Goldy into a martyr, which is absolutely something that we don't want. We want to be able to debate people like Faith Goldy. We want rationally minded liberals to be in the audience and in the questioning lineup for Faith Goldy's talks, and put to her the hard questions. The questions that Faith Goldy can't answer. The questions that, if asked, might actually leave Faith Goldy with egg on her face. But when you get her event cancelled, the only thing that you're proving is that you're afraid of her. You're not strong, you're not graceful, you're not peaceful, and you're certainly not brave. You're just being cowards. I'll have more to say on the Lindsay Shepherd topic in the coming weeks. I'm still working on How Cooked Is Canada 4, which is all about Jordan Peterson. You're not going to see that next week, but you will probably see it the week after, because there's quite a lot to go through. But that about does it for this week. Happy Canada Day, everybody. If you enjoy this content and the other stuff that I do, please consider clicking on that Patreon link, because I could use the help right now. And if you also like video games, I stream a variety of fun stuff 5 evenings a week over on my Twitch channel as well. So drop by and say hi sometime. I hope to see you there. I love you.